Okay, in this lesson, we're going to continue our work with Vertex, and we're going to focus specifically on vertex form. Our learning target for this lesson says I can write a quadratic equation in vertex form by using completing the square. So completing the square was one of the methods that we learned to solve quadratic equations at the beginning of Unit 8, and we're going to be using those steps and that knowledge in this lesson. So to review how to complete the square, we're going to be doing number 2 from your Regents packet. So if you have your Regents packet printed out or you're keeping track of these problems on a piece of paper, we're going to be doing question number 2. So question number 2 says to solve the equation by completing the square. So we know that completing the square is the only method that we don't want our equation to be in standard form, which is great because this equation is already not in standard form. So I'm just going to rewrite x squared plus 4x equals 2. Notice I left a space after the 4x. Step 2 of completing the square is the step that we've nicknamed half square share. So in this case, you take your b term. Our b term here is 4. We're going to take half of 4, which is 2. We're going to square that. 2 times 2 gives us 4. And then we're going to share that, meaning add that to both sides of our equation. Again, that step is called half square share. Step 3 of completing the square says to factor the left side and simplify the right side. So on the left side, I notice I have a trinomial with a of 1. That's our easier type of factoring. So I'm going to set up my 2 binomials and start them both with x. And the question we always ask ourselves is what multiplies to c and also adds to b. So in this case, what 2 numbers multiply to positive 4 and also add to positive 4? Hopefully that's relatively obvious that we're going to use positive 2 and positive 2 because 2 times 2 is 4 and 2 plus 2 is also 4. In completing the square, you should always have the same binomial twice because we're going to then just write it once, squared. We also need to simplify our right side. Simple enough. 2 plus 4 gives us 6. Now we're up to step 4, which is to take the square root of both sides. On the left side, the square and the square roots are inverse, so those cancel out. We're just left with x plus 2. Now on the right side, we have the square root of 6. We don't know what the square root of 6 is because 6 is not a perfect square, so we're going to leave it as plus or minus the square root of 6. We always ask ourselves, can we simplify this any further? But in this case, we cannot. 6 is not a perfect square, and none of the factors of 6 are perfect squares besides just 1. So we actually can't simplify this any further than plus or minus the square root of 6. Our last step is to get the x by itself by subtracting 2 over to the other side. So our final answer would be positive and negative square root of 6 subtracted 2. So again, those are the steps for completing this square. If you need a reminder of those steps, go back to your part 2 of solving quadratics packet, and those steps are on page 7. For this lesson here, we're going to be looking at page 6 in our new packet, Graphing Quadratic Functions. And you'll notice that today we're trying to use completing the square in order to identify the vertex. So as a reminder, in our last lesson, we learned about vertex form. Vertex form looks like this, y equals a parentheses x minus h squared plus k, where h and k represent our vertex. So our goal in this lesson is essentially to make our equations look like this vertex form so that we can easily identify the vertex. Our mini lesson problem comes from the June Regents exam from last year. It says to determine and state the vertex of f of x equals x squared minus 2x minus 8 using the method of completing the square. So we're basically trying to take this equation that's in standard form and make it look like this vertex form so that we can easily identify the vertex. So the first thing that we're going to do is just rewrite our equation in standard form. But you're going to notice I'm going to leave a little space here and just space out the minus 8. So the first thing is just to take that c term, again this would be our a, our b, and our c in standard form, and just space out the c term a little bit. The next step is still the same second step that we've used when we're completing the square, which is called half square share. So again, we take our b term. My b term in this problem is -2. We're going to take half. So half of -2 would be -1. We're going to square that. -1 squared would be +1, because -1 times -1 is +1. And then we're going to share that. But you're going to notice that our share is going to look a little bit different when we are using completing the square just to rewrite in vertex form. I'm still going to put a +1 here like I did in completing the square. But now what I need to do in order to balance that out and not change our equation is I'm going to put a -1 on the end. So notice that I've not actually really changed my equation at all. If I write +1 -1, that's essentially 0. So I have not mathematically changed my equation. So again, in that step, we did half square share. We add in the number that we get, but then we also subtract that number from the end. Our next step, similar to the next step with completing the square, is going to be to factor. So we're going to factor here this trinomial. We're going to ask ourselves what multiplies to c, which here is +1, and adds to our b term, which is -2. Now the numbers that work here would be -1 and -1, because -1 times -1 is +1, and -1 plus -1 is -2. So we know that we can factor this into x minus 1 times x minus 1, which we know can also be written as x minus 1 squared. So I just factored that first trinomial, and now we're just going to simplify right here. -8 minus 1 would give us -9. So you'll notice what we have right now is we have f of x equals x minus 1 squared minus 9. And if you notice, this looks just like our vertex form. So we've correctly now taken this equation from standard form and used completing the square to write it in vertex form. This question also asked us to state the vertex. So if we remember from our last lesson about the vertex, our vertex is our HK. In this case, the H is that 1, but we know we always take the opposite. Inside the parentheses, it's written as -1. So I know my X value of the vertex will be +1. And then my K on the end represents the Y value of my vertex, which is -9. So we've used completing the square to rewrite this in vertex form to then identify the vertex. So before we move on to the guided practice, our think, write, pair, share question says to summarize the steps for using completing the square to write our equation in standard form. So let's summarize those steps that we just did. The first thing that we did, I'm going to just call this to space out the C term. Again, in this problem, our C term was -8. So the first thing I did is just kind of space that number out and move it to the side. The next thing that we did is we did the half square share. But in this case, again, after we take half square, what we mean by share is that we're going to add and subtract. So in this case, our sharing is really just an adding and a subtracting. We added that +1, then we subtracted the -1 from the end to balance it out. The next thing that we did was we factored the trinomial. So that was how we got the x minus 1 squared, and then we simplified the end, meaning we just did the -8 minus 1 to give us the -9. Okay, so we're going to try another question like this. Again, we're using completing the square just to rewrite our equation in a different form. We're taking it from standard form and using it, completing the square to write in vertex form. Our guided practice problem also comes from a Regents exam from last year, the August Regents. You'll notice again that they're giving us an equation here in standard form, and they want us to rewrite it in vertex form to get one of these answer choices. So go ahead and pause this video and try the steps by yourself and come back to check your answer. Okay, so to go over this, we're going to use our steps from the mini lesson. The first thing we said was to space out that C term. So I'm just going to leave a little space here and put -18 at the end. Step 2 is our half square shares. So we're going to take our B term, which here our B term is 24. Half of 24 would give us 12. 12 squared would give us 144. And now to share, we're going to add 144, but then to balance that out, because we're still working on the same side of the equation, we're going to subtract 144. Next is to factor our trinomial. So here our trinomial, we're trying to figure out what two numbers multiply to give us our C term, which is now 144, and add to give us our B term, which is now 24. So hopefully the numbers jump out at you that we're going to use here, which are positive 12 and positive 12, because 12 times 12 is 144, and 12 plus 12 is 24. So we're going to factor this to x plus 12 times x plus 12, which can also just be written as x plus 12 squared. On the end here, we're just going to do -18 minus 144. You can use your calculator to help with this, and you should get -162 or minus 162. So if we compare this to our answer choices, you should get choice 1 as your answer for the guided practice. At this point, we're ready for our checkpoint question. So please, on a piece of paper, go ahead and try to answer this question. Do not just pick an answer 1, 2, 3, and 4. We want to see your work. Please pause this video and come back when you're ready to go over the answers. Okay, so to go over our checkpoint question here, your first step, you should have spaced out the positive 7. Half square shares our next step. So if we take half of -12, that's -6. -6 squared gives us positive 36. So we're going to add 36. And then to balance that out, we're going to subtract 36. To factor here, you should have asked yourselves what two numbers multiply to give you your new C, which is positive 36, and add to give you -12. So you should have listed out the factors of 36, and you should have chosen -6 and -6. Because -6 times -6 gives you positive 36, -6 plus -6 gives you -12. So this would be written as x minus 6 squared. And then 7 minus 36, that should give us -29. So pausing at this point, we should have x minus 6 squared minus 29. So we can go ahead and eliminate choice 1 and choice 2 because those have plus 43. So now we're down to 3 and 4. Those have correctly rewritten this standard form in vertex form, but now we need to see which one correctly identifies the vertex. If we remember, this represents our H, this represents our K, and we always write the H as opposite whatever's in the parentheses, so we'll have positive 6, and then our Y value will be our K, which is -29. So for your checkpoint, you should have had choice 3. So moving into our independent practice, if you tried the checkpoint question and you got choice 1 or 2, or you just had no idea how to do that, you're going to start with red. If you did the checkpoint question but you chose choice 4, you're going to start with yellow. And if you chose choice 3, including all of the work required to get that answer, you're going to start with green. Again, in order to get your classwork credit for this lesson, we need to see a picture of your checkpoint question and whatever independent practice problems you complete. So please go ahead and pause this video and complete your independent practice and come back when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, so at this point, you should be coming back to the video only if you're ready to check your answers. Here are the answers for 1 and 2 on page 7. And here are the answers for 3 and 4, also on page 7. So again, to get your classwork credit for this lesson, you need to submit a picture of your checkpoint question and whatever independent practice you completed. Even though some of these were multiple choice, we still need to see your work because these questions require a bit of work. So do not just write down an answer choice. Please also show us your work. And finally, we're going to end this lesson just by comparing this lesson to what we've already done with completing the square. So our question says, how is using completing the square to identify the vertex different than using completing the square to solve a quadratic equation? So again, to identify the vertex, that's what we were doing in this lesson. We were trying to rewrite our equations in vertex form to identify the vertex, whereas we used to use it to solve a quadratic equation. So this was what we did at the beginning of Unit 8. So a big difference that jumps out to me, I still want to use that half square share, but when I'm using it to identify the vertex, that is when I add and subtract the number on the same side of the equation. Because if you remember in this lesson, we were always just working on one side of the equation. So we had to both add and subtract that half square share number in order to balance our equation. However, when we were solving a quadratic equation, this was when we share on both sides. So after we did our half square share, we would share that number on the left side and the right side. We were working with both sides of our equation. So again, you've now seen that completing the square can be used to do two things. First, it could be used to solve a quadratic equation, and now we know that it can also be used to identify the vertex by writing our equations in vertex form.